Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome to the InfoMullet COVID-19 Ask Me Anything. I am Timothy Clancy, your chief mulleteer. This is Bonky, the emotional support donkey, who is joining us as always today with protective gear in place. He's following the rules. If you like and follow us on the InfoMullet or share this feed, we're going to go over several topics today. Also, if you haven't and would like to, we appreciate all the mulleteer support. Mulleteer subscribers, only $5 a month. You can subscribe at www.patreon.com/infomullet. And we're going to go ahead and get started because there's a couple of things I wanted to go over today, and we're going to branch out from just being COVID related to also being economics related. So welcome to everyone who's joined in. I see Celia, Albert, Chad coming in, and everyone else who's on. So let's go ahead and get started. In the last Ask Me Anything, I did a profile on sort of the hammer and dance pandemic response. And today I wanted to contrast that pandemic response option with the other one that's in the news a lot, and that is alternatively called induced herd immunity, or it's sometimes referred to as the Swedish model. And I want to be clear, these pandemic responses, when we say that it is a hammer and dance, that has a lot of variation within it. Likewise, if we say something is pursuing induced herd immunity or the Swedish model, that has a lot of variation. But what I wanted to do today was to evaluate the Swedish model, the induced herd immunity model, and show out that where not just is it struggling to perform well against other models, it's not performing well against its own objectives. So if we remember, in the induced herd immunity, we start with mobilization and lockdown because we're delaying the virus's spread. Then we contain it, and while we're containing it, we build up our capabilities, and then we begin reopening, and you go for the decisive engagement. The Swedish model is the opposite. It's very different. The Swedish, the concept of operations, the phases of the Swedish model or the induced herd immunity model, and this is sort of wherever you see this implemented, it's the same general criteria. The first thing they're going to do is take the elderly and vulnerable population and secure them in isolation. So the goal of the induced herd immunity model is not to lock down the whole society, but to take those who are perceived to be most vulnerable to COVID, protect them. And the second one is to let those who are younger, have no underlying conditions, and are perceived to be healthier go on about their ways. This obviously keeps the economy open, and it also is believed to expose those who won't have as bad effects. They won't die as much, they won't go in the hospital as much, and it builds in them this concept of herd immunity. And the theory is that over time, you will build a herd immunity such that you will get 60 to 80% of the population has been exposed and has developed antibodies and immunities, and then you can allow the elderly to get back in the population because they will be protected by this herd immunity. And the Swedish model is very popular among certain populations because it sort of promises that for the majority of society, you can kind of keep doing what you were doing all along, or the induced herd immunity. And Sweden's not the only country that's tried it. The United Kingdom's tried it, the Netherlands have tried it, but Sweden's the only country that continues to do it, or a variation of it, and with good reason, because pretty much on everything you might look at, the induced herd immunity approach is sort of failing relative to other countries, and it's even failing on its own objectives. So I wanted to begin with, like, the first point of the induced herd, of all these pandemic responses, is to reduce the deaths and to, you wouldn't eliminate them, but to have less deaths than you might otherwise have. And I wanted to share a chart I put together that shows the per capita death count for Nordic countries. These are all the Baltic countries. So this is Sweden and its immediate neighbors. And I'm doing this because, you can compare countries from around the world, and they'll have different populations, different socioeconomic resources, different political models, different underlying conditions. But when we talk about the Baltic countries here, and it's Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Finland, Norway, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these all share a common water boundary, and Sweden, Finland, and Norway are all on the same peninsula. Sweden, you've got the small cities on the eastern side there, close to Russia. These are all countries in the same region, not exactly the same political model, but very similar socioeconomic, demographic-wise. And on the left here is the deaths per 100,000 people. Now, this is from today's New York Times. And this is a death per capita. It's not the same as the crude death rate, which is the deaths as a percentage of cases. But and the blue columns are the deaths per capita. And right away, we see that Sweden is multiple times worse. These other countries, Denmark, Germany, Finland, Norway, all these other ones have adopted a hammer and dance style approach, the one I talked about on Saturday. But Sweden didn't, and it's really showing in their death rate per capita. Now, a lot of people immediately say, well, Sweden's more population dense than Norway. Well, that's not, I mean, that may be true that Sweden's more dense than Norway, but it's not more population dense than these other countries. So the red I've put in here is just to show the population density. So obviously the most population dense is Germany, but Sweden's down here, very low population density. And some of these other countries have the same or higher population densities, but much lower deaths per capita. And you can also take a look at this from the crude death rate. So this is overall deaths that are deaths in the thing, but you might also look at it from the crude, let's see here, make sure I've got the right thing going. Here we go. Had to quickly bring up the chart. This is the crude death rate. So now we can look at it from a standpoint of how does Sweden compare it as a percentage of deaths for its overall infection, right? So maybe it had more cases, but this percentage normalizes that. So the first one we just looked at, per capita death rate, is just amount in the overall population. The crude death rate looks as a percentage of all your confirmed cases. And there's a lot of people who are like, well, Sweden's got more cases. It doesn't bear out in the data. Again, we have Denmark is the blue, Estonia is the gold, Finland is the light green here that's over on the right, Norway is the red, and Sweden is this one that jumps up, is now over 12% crude death rate. And it's not just that these deaths are happening, and of course you can compare them now, compared to all these other ones, Denmark, Norway, Finland, they all did the hammer and the dance, and you can see their crude death rates are very low. But remember, one of the objectives of Sweden is to protect the population, the elderly population. Well, 50% of the deaths in Sweden are coming from elderly homes. And it's embarrassing / shameful, I gotta say, that this morning or last night, the Swedish official who is the architect of this kind of said, well, we've been surprised at how many deaths there have been. That wasn't intended. And you sort of, when you're talking about pandemic responses and the person who's putting it together and organized sort of admits, well, we're surprised by the number of deaths we have, that's not a good sign. And this is, I think, where we got to be very careful about, again, the Swedish model promises relief from the pandemic by continuing. Now, they aren't continuing business as usual. Over time, Sweden has instituted some measures. They've reduced the number of gatherings to no more than 50. They've encouraged social isolation, but bars are still open. You may have a bar as long as it has under 50 people. They may all be all in there together, side by side. You have lots of businesses are open, lots of people moving around. So these death rates are showing that it's not working as well on the to both reduce deaths, and that 50% of those deaths, it's getting into the elderly homes. This chief scientist, I think it's Andrew Breivik, was basically saying, well, we thought that we would isolate the elderly and be able to protect the elderly homes. That didn't work out, and it's one of these consequences. You can't go back and reverse it. But another part of the Swedish model, or the induced herd immunity model, is the presumption that, well, yes, a lot of elderly died, but maybe it's not so bad for those who are younger and healthier. And I wanted to show, oops, wrong one here. This is the hospitalization rate, and this is from the US, so different demographics here, but this shows the hospitalization rate by age demographic. We're always focused on deaths, and the presumption is, well, if you're not old and you don't have underlying conditions, you're gonna be fine. These provisional data from the CDC shows that we have an increasing level of hospitalizations per 100,000, and what it is on the left here is the number of hospitalizations per 100,000. The colors are the age demographics, so brown is 18 to 50, Yellow is 50 to 64, green is 65 plus, blue is 75 to 84-year-old, and red is 85. Clearly, the older you are, the more likely not only to die you are, but you're ought to be hospitalized. But that doesn't mean these other lower ages, 50 to 65 or 18 to 50, are free of consequences. I put some markers on here so we could begin to understand the national averages so you could get a conceptual of the mental model. Firearm injuries, we've already exceeded that. So you're more likely to be hospitalized now from COVID-19 than you are a firearm injury, but that's not, those are pretty rare. But hypertension, car accidents, if you're 50 to 64, you're more likely to be hospitalized now from COVID-19 than you are if you had hypertension or you were in a car accident. And again, I put the influenza. When people say this is the normal flu, well, hospitalizations, at least for the elderly, are now over the normal flu and even getting over diabetes, which is one of the top causes of hospitalizations in the country. So this argument in the induced herd immunity that the younger people won't suffer consequences is clearly not bearing out. And that's a problem with making assumptions about a novel virus that we don't know enough about. And the final big assumption, the reason you're doing all of this stuff is so you can build herd immunity. Herd immunity assumes that if you've been exposed to the virus, you're going to develop an antibody in sufficient volume that will protect you for a robust amount of time, a year, 5 years. And that is the reason herd immunity works, is because it creates a protective shell of people with enough antibodies that the virus can't hop around and find the vulnerable population. But you need probably 60 to 80% to reach herd immunity. And it's not, the way this is reached, it's not like you get to 60% and you're there. The infection will continue to spread even as your population raises in immunity levels. So it's really, you got to get close to 90% herd immunity before the contagion breaks, and then you'll drop back down. Right now, Sweden is it's claiming to be somewhere between 10 and 30% have been exposed to the virus. With the antibody test, it's really hard to tell. But let's say they've gotten to 30%. Well, 30% of what? There's no evidence so far that actually being exposed gives you a robust immunity. So this entire premise of the induced herd immunity model that Sweden is betting on is assuming that this novel virus will act as other viruses we've had. But I've said it on Saturday, and I'll say it again. If getting herd immunity was as easy as doing what we already did and not having to change anything, the history of indigenous people in North and South America, when the original colonists and conquistadors met them, would be a lot different. The history of Europe with the Black Death would be a lot different. We do not have a good track record as humans just naturally building herd immunity until we got to the point where we were able to create a vaccine. This is why the hammer and the dance pandemic response is probably a better response, because it's still, it puts that delaying effect of the lockdown so we can understand, are our assumptions correct? And if it turns out we are building herd immunity and the science shows we can get herd immunity, we can go in the dance and begin exposing people and getting that herd immunity. But now Sweden already has a death rate it can't reverse. It's already lost those folks. It's already lost that elderly population. This is the problem, I think, of when crisis management intersects with what I would call very rigid academics. The scientist in Sweden was saying, well, we don't know, so we have to wait till all the data's in. When you're managing a crisis and you have two courses of action, neither of which you know which is the right one, but one of them has an irreversible or unmitigatable effect and the other doesn't, you want to go with the one that you can then reverse or mitigate. If we're wrong and Sweden was right, the hammer and the dance was wrong, we can open up the economy and mitigate the economic damage. You cannot mitigate a death once it's happened. And that's one reason that I've been kind of critical of the induced herd immunity model. Now, every country that's tried it other than Sweden has abandoned it, but every country that touched it is currently in the top 10 death per capita rate. The Netherlands, right up there. United Kingdom, they abandoned it, but they're still suffering. And I want to be clear, I'm not holding the United States up as this gold standard. Far from it. We're not doing well either. But if you think about Sweden's death rate is more than the United States right now, per capita death rate. So it's and if you're comparing yourself to the United States when it comes to pandemic responses, you're not looking to be a front runner in this race. You're at the back with those of us who are lagging. So all right, so that's the herd immunity discussion I want to have. And then The next thing is to talk about, let me scroll here and get to my, all right, so quick shift to economic. What's going on with the economy? This morning, the ADP payroll announced the job losses for April, and the way they track this ADP is they do a lot of payroll. They manage a lot of the payroll in the United States, so they have a very good indication of when someone is added or dropped from the rolls. And this is a market-based way of adding job addition or job losses. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a survey method where they go out and survey hiring managers and human resources. That will come out probably tomorrow. But today, ADP announced that in April, 20 million people lost their jobs. And to say that is a record is an understatement. That is more job losses in April than the entirety of the Great Recession. So I'm not making these pandemic responses about the hammer and the dance and the Swedish or the induced herd immunity model unaware of the economic consequences that the hammer and the dance model has. These are pretty big. And we can look at some of these indicators that now are coming out from, these come from Calculated Risk Blog, and all the sources for this are down in the bottom. So if you want, a Calculated Risk Blog is a great blog to track economic indicators. And a high frequency economic indicator is one that we get the data very quickly. Like this unemployment, it was a month. The month was over, we get the data. Sometimes with GDP, it's multiple months. They can be really lagging. Unemployment is lagging, but the high frequency indicators, the ones I'm going to go over here, they are leading indicators, and they can tell us where the economy is going and whether it's recovering or, in this case, not recovering. So just going to run through a few of these to show what it looks like. And it's not going to be too much of a surprise. You're going to see kind of a theme here. But this is the TSA checkpoint travel numbers. So the TSA releases every week how many people went through their checkpoint. It's a proxy for travel. Well, you can see it flatlined and it bottomed out. And these indicators I'm going to show are mainly travel related. These are the sectors that are going to perhaps be the biggest hit and the longest to recover from the pandemic. Dining, restaurant, right? You can see here how it falls off a cliff down to 100% reduction. Now, this is the United States, California, Florida, Georgia, New York, Texas. So there's a couple states mixed in, but you can see when it drops 100% year-over-year decline, that means you've gone to zero activity from whatever it was before. And you can see this drop-off happen as the mobilizations and lockdowns begin. And you've seen the uptick. Remember, this is a high-frequency indicator. So you've already got some of these upticks here as some states start to reopen. But that's going to be a very difficult situation to recover from this sort of restaurant perspective. Gross movie sales, right? Obviously, cinemas are not doing well. So this looks at the gross ticket sales and dollar volume. And again, you can see it hit. This comes from Box Office Mojo. My forecast that in 2022, there would be one or less cinematic releases for MCU Universe seems to be more on track every day. Not the way I intended it, but hopefully and this is hotel occupancy rate by week. Again, so you have here a couple, the median is in the dark blue. The dashed was 2019 by way of comparison. The Great Recession is in black here. So these are, Calculated Risk Blog does a good job of making this economic information visual. So you can see here, the Great Recession, hotel occupancy, again, an indicator of travel. You can see 2019 and the median, and you can see, again, it falls off into an unprecedented low level of hotel occupancy. But another big indicator is going to be the delinquencies. We're talking about mortgages, and the concern is, will delinquencies rise on mortgage? Will people stop paying their mortgage? Because remember, that turns a exogenous shock recession into a credit or fiscal collapse recession or depression, and those are much harder to recover from. We only have through March right now, but you can see here we're starting off at a good position because the 2000 to 2005 average is just shown cyclically here, and you can see there's a definite cycle pattern here over these years to the percentage. But the one we're currently at now, we're lower than the average, and we had just about touched the record low. In fact, we had just touched it earlier. So we're starting off with less delinquencies than we would normally, but that number is going to go up, and how fast it goes up is going to tell us a lot about to what extent there's a risk of fiscal collapse. And finally, this is now more of a leading indicator on home sales. Real estate drives a tremendous amount of the economy, from home construction starts to furnishings when people move into a house. So the real estate showings tells us what's coming out, because you don't normally sell a house without showing it. So this again is a couple states that just shows the downturn. And again, you see some states as they begin their reopening move back up. But I think what we're going to see with these economic charts is not just how's the economy performing, but we're also going to see the consequence of having to close and reopen, or excuse me, reopen and close again. If we have a wave 1.5, we'll see this downward up and where it increased, and then where they had to close it again if we have another round of closures. So that is a brief, just getting into the economics to ground people on some of these high frequency indicators that we're seeing and why it's important to do the right things in the hammer and the dance. The phase 2 of the hammer and the dance is designed to reopen the economy, but you've done the work to justify it and earn it. And that's what's happening around the world. Countries that practiced hammer and dance are reopening their economies in a very cautious way, but they've sort of earned that right to do it. I don't think in the United States, if we spent, if Georgia spent the lockdown period just whistling and hoping things would get better and then reopen without doing any prep, that doesn't mean the Georgia outcome is going to be better because other countries are opening. All right, so let's see here. Make sure, let me review if there's any questions so far. Good, yep, good to see you, Melissa, Ed, Yvonne, Mike. Jennifer, Belgium is, so if you look at the top 15, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg are all in the top 15 per capita death. All of those countries had policies that were early on, I would say, ill-advised. Netherlands was business as usual and it flirted with induced herd immunity. Belgium was slightly different or slightly similar. They've all adopted mobilization and lockdown, but at this point, their per capita death rates are very, very high. They're in the top 15 of the world, I believe. And this is all in the New York Times. You can go get their per capita rates. David, Heather, good to see you. Rory, good to see you. Jennifer Hartshorn. And keep in mind that top 15 per capita death rate, it now includes some tiny island countries like San Marino and Andorra and things like that. So it's already spiked in favor of Sabrina, good to see you. Valeria. Yeah, those crazy academics, Jennifer, I know. They're Paul, Jason. What indicators show it's safe to open a border between countries? So Valeria, I'll link. The hammer and the dance has a series of steps. There's 3 phases. A delaying phase, where you're delaying the virus, that's the lockdown. And in that phase, you're doing certain actions, building PPE, building testing sufficiency, building your contact and tracing capability, and creating capabilities to isolate those who are infected. In the dance mode, you reverse the lockdown and you identify those who are infected, secure them, but allow the rest to reopen. If you have 2 countries bordering each other, it would be a relative comparison of how each is doing on its own. So if you're talking, I believe, about Canada and the US, if Canada is doing very, very well in all those measures, but the US is doing very, very poorly, it's going to be a tough judgment call to decide to reopen that border because you still are risking the contagion spreading across the border. A good scenario is what you're going to see in some of these Southeast Oceania countries that are now forming into trade consortiums where they're talking about that they have contained the virus or broken the outbreak cycle. They have these measures in place. They're now opening trade between them. And so you're creating this bubble effect. You're going to start to see it in Europe around Germany, where countries that are managing it well begin opening borders with each other, but continuing to close borders with countries that are not doing well. Tyson, good to see you. Hope you're doing well out there in Ankeny. Percentage of, Mike Morrison's asking, what's the percentage of workforce compared to the Great Depression? We're going to be at that level. You talk about the Great Depression, you're somewhere between 20 and 30%. We're going to be estimated somewhere between 15 and 30% this month, or in April when it comes out, or in May at the latest. So this is what, I mean, even back in, if you look at my forecast in late March, I was basically saying in March 24th, we were entering a Great Depression. So I think, I mean, there's technical amounts. The Great Depression is so long at a certain level of loss, but effectively, I think we're already in a Great Depression. Jennifer, good to see you. Ryan asked a good question. Why do we think things in Europe appear to have been so terrible, but here in the US, it seems to most people that this whole thing was an overreaction? One of the things we know about COVID is it is very locally clustered. These contagion outbreaks are not spread, and if anyone's seen my extended take on fractal segmentation, you know that geographic inequality is a huge factor in perception. And so if you have a large concentration in New York City that's driving a lot of the deaths, the rest of the country may be like, I'm looking around and getting signals from my local area. I don't see it being that bad. Or take a Georgia example. Southern Georgia, Albany, Georgia was a small rural town that just got hammered by the deaths. But up in Atlanta, they're 3-4 hours away. They're looking around, and if they're not familiar with Albany, they're not going to see that. What shifted, I think, from March into April is what I called the nationalization of the death rate. We're going from these local clusters, sort of east side Seattle, where the initial outbreak was heavily concentrated, New York, areas that people can pick out, Chicago. We're now seeing the death rate nationalized, and that there's outbreaks all over the country in rural areas. And it may not be as many, bodies. It may not get the headlines because it's not 1,000 a day like New York was doing, or 500 a day. But you have 20, 30 people dying every week in some of these areas and these states, and that adds up. That's why we're still at about 2,000 deaths a day. But New York has dropped to like a quarter of where it was. So we're nationalizing the death. And what this perception is going to drive is more people will begin to know someone who's died, know someone who's been sick, have seen it with themselves or experienced it themselves. This is a natural change that's going to happen over time. And to what extent people believe it, at some point, some great academic that Jennifer Hartshorns knows is going to go back and do a comparison with Black Death conspiracy theories. I'm sure there was someone during the Black Death that was just running around going, this is fine. Let's reopen everything back up. Let's go back to ye old pub or bar and or whatever the Middle Ages version of a hair salon was, and just do that again. I'm sure there is a undercurrent of this kind of denialism, but I think it's going to become harder and harder to deny over time. Okay, and then let's see. So let's talk about food supply. Again, bit of an economic angle, but a lot of scary headlines are going out. And again, this is an area where it's not so bad. So we've just talked about a lot of things that are worse and bad and terrible. The food supply, I don't think is as in worse shape as people are running around and saying. So the headlines, right? Tyson came out last week, Tyson Foods, the food chain is breaking. You see updates of the very real outbreaks in meat packing plants. I'm not trying to diminish. These are very serious outbreaks that are infecting hundreds of people. Often they're vulnerable populations themselves, consisting of immigrant populations with reduced access to healthcare. And then the obvious impact to the supply is these food producers are very concentrated, and when they get shut down, there's a question of where's the meat going to come from. You see claims of the Defense Production Act. Trump's going to keep these open and keep them running, and it's creating a bit of a concern. And I wanted to put some context around that so we can kind of get a feel for what we're talking about. First of all, there are indications of sort of reduced and spoilage on some types of food, usually fresher food, but the big concern is on meat. So first of all, we need to, of the entire food chain and food supply, we need to focus on meat. And the first thing is the US eats more meat than just about anyone else. So we are at a very high level of meat consumption. And what I think we need to be careful of is there's generally a few types of meat, beef, pork, and chicken. And within that, there are a variety of selections. And what these outages that are occurring is not like I've seen people say, well, have no meat. What it means is certain cuts of meat in a certain style, like certain cuts of beef or certain styles of pork, may be reduced availability, which leads to higher prices, which leads to either not eating that meat, substituting it with something else, like I eat chicken instead of beef, or imports from external countries. So the big news this week is where's the beef? Wendy's, right? Wendy's ran out of beef. Well, Wendy's ran out of beef because they're the one fast food places that uses fresh beef. So they're the first ones to get hit by it. All the ones that are, if you're not out of beef right now and you're a fast food place, guess what? You're using really frozen beef we have a lot of supply of. The other thing to keep in mind is how much of the food supply in the US is just wasted. So if we think about, you need to supply 100, there's 100 units of supply, and this is a notional number. About 20 to 30% of that supply is wasted every month. It doesn't actually go to being consumed. It's not a demand, it's just a supply. About 10% of that supply comes from overseas. So, and our biggest overseas exporters of beef to the US are Australia and New Zealand. They're doing fine. They're much better off than we are. So you now have about 30 to 40% of the supply is going to be accounted for either in waste or this export coming in. And what that leaves is the remainder. As you start to lose some of these spot things, it's not going to be that you're 100% out of beef, for example, or chicken. You might be only able to meet 50% of the supply. What that's going to do is it's going to create, obviously, the profit incentive that other countries will begin shipping their meat in here that may cause shortages to other countries they would have provided to, but now there's a profit motivation for Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand. These are all our big suppliers of beef. They're going to want to sell their beef here because the price is going up, and their production is less impacted than ours, although Canada still has some problems. You're going to see people, as the price goes up, they're going to say, I'm going to alternate or eat less meat or choose a different type, and it wouldn't hurt Americans to eat less meat. So I think we have to put in context that this concern about running out of meat is a bit of an overreaction. Now, we know from the bullwhip effect, if everyone goes out and buys the shelves clear of beef tonight, it's going to look like we have an outage because someone's going to show up and they're going to have pictures of empty shelves, and you're going to get this feedback effect just like toilet paper. And that can often create more harm than the actual outages themselves. Some of the meat packing plants are already coming back online. Others are going to stay down for cleaning. This is something, I'm not saying this is no effect. Prices may increase dramatically, and that may reduce access to meat. But it's not going to be a question of there's no meat available. It's going to be how much are you willing to pay or substitute or do without versus we're running out of protein. US estimates total 40% of whether it's transport. Yeah, Jeff, thanks for the numbers. Yeah, where's the beef? Yeah, Jeff saying the waste amount is 40% of total. And then the final topic I wanted to go over, and then I wanted to get some of the questions and discussion, was about children and COVID-19. And there's a couple of things going on. You know, again, part of the herd immunity theory is that you can keep schools open and keep life as normal because the children aren't susceptible to it because they don't get sick. Well, a couple studies have come out that, again, have punched holes in this. I mean, induced herd immunity cannot catch a break to save its life right now. Every claim it's made is getting punctured, and the reason why is it made claims about a novel virus without having the evidence in hand. But the specific claim is that we can keep the schools open. Two studies, one from China coming out of when the outbreak hit Wuhan, found that the kids, the children, right, 17 and under, were only 1/3 as susceptible to the virus, but they have a contact rate in school 3 times higher than an adult. So if you think about what passes a contagion, it's not just how susceptible you are, but how many points of contact you have within which to receive that contagion. And so it kind of washes out. Children may be less susceptible on average, but when they're in school, they have a much higher contact rate, which makes sense. If you've ever seen kids in school, they're not easy to keep distance. A German study took a little bit different. They looked at actual children who tested positive for COVID and went back and studied their viral loads and whether they were symptomatic. And what they found is that a lot of the children were asymptomatic, much like we know that the younger you get, the less chances you are of symptoms. Doesn't mean you're free of consequences, but the rates go down. But the children who were asymptomatic had the same high or higher viral loads as adult. And the viral load is the ability of the virus to infect someone. The higher your viral load, the more likely you are to infect someone else. So even though children were asymptomatic, they found that just like other asymptomatic carriers, they're able to spread it. So this concept that we can expose children and be okay sort of misses the point that those children then go home, they deal with other children, and those children go home, and teachers and staff and all of these points of contact and interaction. They estimate that closing schools takes about 0.3 of a point off of the R-0 factor. On the R-0 factor, an R1 means for every 1 person infected, 1 more person will be infected. I think COVID's around 2 point something or 3 R factor, and it changes over time. But this is, if you have 1-to-1, it means the virus is still going to continue growing. This 0.3 matters because a lot of places in the US, they're estimating the R factor right now is 0.8. So it's actually declining. The virus is not able to, for every person infected, they're only infecting 0.8 of another person, so it's going to decline. If you open the school and add this 0.3 back on the 0.8, you're now over 1 again. It's another indication, or another way to think of it is the growth of the virus is 30 to 40% more when schools are open. Now, these studies, with all studies with coronavirus, you have to be careful. They were smaller studies. There is one that is starting now. It's called the HERO study, and it's going to look at 6,000 children across 2,000 families on a longitudinal study over time, and that will give us really good information. It won't be done, obviously, until much later, so we won't be able to have that information. So again, another burst in the bubble of herd immunity theory is that children are just as likely to carry or pass on the disease as anyone else, even if they don't show symptoms or consequences. But there is a new wrinkle now into the theory of how protected children are from consequences. And that has to do with not just this is the hospitalization rate I pulled from the CDC, the provisional data. And again, these provisional data charts, they're subject to revision by the CDC. They'll be revised over 8 weeks, but the revisions tend to be upwards. This is the hospitalization rate for two child age demographics, 0 to 4 years old and 5 to 17 years old. And you can see that it's rising. It's not 0. Now, it's less than the influenza on average for, babies and infants get hospitalized for influenza more than teens and young adults, but you can see it's rising. It's not that it's 0. There is an impact. It may be less than the flu, but it's not consequence free. And there's a really worrying trend that's now coming out in the United Kingdom and New York. Jennifer Grace Collin mentioned this on Saturday, and I looked into it. It's something called, it's a Kawasaki-like syndrome. It's only been sort of uncovered in the last few weeks, and there's a few dozen cases in the UK now that have been identified. They started looking for them in the New York City. They found a few dozen cases there. And what this is the Kawasaki syndrome. It's a rare syndrome. It's been associated with previous coronavirus strains. And the symptoms are you get a fever and a rash, but when it's untreated, it can lead to really bad heart conditions like a coronary aneurysm. And it tends to affect children 6 months to 6 years. It's very rare in the US. What's happening now isn't Kawasaki. It's Kawasaki-like. They're saying it has a fever, it may have a rash, it has abdominal pain, sometimes the rash is raised, but it's much more like an inflammatory or blood-related condition than the traditional COVID, which is being described as a respiratory condition. So they're saying to keep an eye out for children rashness to redness of the eyes, blood circulation problems. It seems to be affecting everything from infants to teenagers. Again, we only have a few dozen cases here in the UK and in the US, so this isn't like it's widespread, but we haven't started looking for it until just the last 2 weeks. So there may be much more of these cases that were being classified as someone else that are some sort of relation to how the coronavirus is affecting younger adults. And it doesn't seem to be driven by a lung or respiratory, but it looks more like it's an overall inflammatory response that can deal with circulation and heart issues. So, I mean, this is something, again, a novel viruses are novel. We don't know what we don't know. And when it comes to these crisis responses and pandemic responses, if you make assumptions on a pandemic and they're not reversible, you're liable to be sort of, the evidence may prove you wrong because you didn't know what you're doing. So you always want to be cautious and sort of humble that we don't know what we don't know, and take an edge of caution and then prove that we are better to do, whether it's better to reopen or we really do think that kids are immune. Let's prove it with the evidence before we take actions that we can't reverse. Oh, so John Rogers is going to say, if you are under 65 and in reasonable health, the threat is minimal. Let's quarantine the people at risk. So John, you've just missed the entire section on herd immunity, where your theory kills more people per capita than just about anything else. So I know you're coming into an advance and agenda, and you have what you think is data, but that data is wrong. I just spent probably 20 minutes describing all the ways that are wrong with it. So if you look back in, there will be some clips and some links. You can find it. I don't have time to go over it again, but you got to be careful with these assertions that, well, more people die of car accidents. Well, that's great. Now we're killing the amount with car accidents, and on top of that, adding something else. We have mechanisms in place to reduce car accidents. We have safety protocols, we have road rules, we have ways that the cars are designed and engineered. We have none of that for coronavirus, and these things are preventable. To say that it's not as bad is to sort of relieve the responsibility we have to minimize the harm where we can. Again, the hammer and the dance routine actually allows you to open up, but you have to do work. You can't just sit back and not do anything and expect the pandemic to treat you well. Go back and look at the Black Death. Go back and look at cholera. Go back and look at smallpox. Go look back and look at any of these viral infections and find out where it didn't require where we were just able to do what we always did and we came out with good outcomes. It doesn't work that way. And apologize if I'm kind of jumping on you, but the entire first half of this thing was talking about what about Sweden? Okay, well, you'll be able to catch up on Sweden. Sweden has a very high per capita death count relative to all its neighbors. So if you think about your question, John, is the quarantining of the elderly and doing everyone else. Sweden did what you're talking about. Norway, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Germany, Denmark did the opposite. They did more of the mobilization and lockdown, and Sweden has probably 3 times the per capita death rate than all those other countries. So you can go back and look. There's some comparisons in there. Let's keep Brent. Good to see you, and sorry for jumping on you, John. I just got done with that. When I get tenuous when people jump in and start advocating an agenda. Let's see what questions are. What good questions are there? Connor, good to see you. Yeah, Jennifer points out that the old Black Death conspiracists weren't literate, so they didn't leave a lot of social media posts. Well, the social media posts of a lot of people are going to be embarrassing. If you go back and look at all points of this thing, you can go back to some feeds and find posts that were made that are now invalidated. And that's the judgment on a good explanatory theory is it doesn't just explain the fragment we're seeing now. It provides a useful forecast of information in the future. Induced herd immunity was one of 5 explanatory theories at the beginning of this in early March. I did the profile in mid-March, but it has since been disproven at every single step of the way. And this isn't just like, it's not like that's the only one. We had the fire break model that we could voluntarily socially isolate, and that would be fine. That was our approach. It didn't work. The evidence said it wasn't working. We reversed. The pandemic is not an actor you can negotiate with or have sort of a rhetorical debate about. It's going to do what it's going to do. And the thing we need to do is sort of react as best we can and then put in the work to make sure that we're not killing the economy. I mean, one of the things that we can't do is assume that it's okay to trade. I mean, there's this big fallacy that human lives and the economy are somehow 2 separate things. The economy exists only in so much as people are alive and have confidence. And so, part of the hammer and the dance response is to reopen the economy, but to put in the effort to do it smartly and be protected from it. What do you think it would take for countries to officially update their criteria for COVID-19 testing, considering most are still fever, cough? Jennifer's asking, what do you think it would take for countries to officially update their criteria for COVID-19 testing? This is one of the challenges of a fast-breaking situation. If you think about the time delay for a country to issue guidance, have that guidance promulgate throughout the system, and have the guidance followed, under best circumstances, that's between 1 month and 5 years. The virus, what we know about the virus is literally changing week by week by week. I remember we thought certain things in February that if we go back and look now, we're going to be like, whoa, those were really bad idea. And the problem with these guidance is they're lagging. And we tend to get anchored to what the first guidance was, which is you got to have a fever, you got to have a cough. I think it depends, like the NIH may be a little bit faster than the CDC, but the problem is not just the guidance being updated. It's how fast the doctors who are now dealing with this incorporate that guidance and use it in their decisions of who gets a test and not get a test. Of course, the way to alleviate this is to ramp up our testing capacity so that it doesn't have to be a criteria. We picked exclusionary criteria. You go back to February, the CDC, we had so few tests initially that when this broke out at the Life Care Center in January and February, the CDC was instructing them not to test everyone because they didn't want to put a precedent in place that anytime you had an outbreak, you would test everyone who got in contact because there weren't enough tests. So we had exclusionary criteria set up our guidance for why we weren't doing testing. And that really hamstrung us for a month and a half. And now we're still living with it, as opposed to if you want to get a test, like I think in France and parts of California, if you want, or Los Angeles, if you want to get a test, you can. They're trying to prioritize who gets it with first line responders, but it's kind of like everyone gets tested, come in for testing. That's how we should be, and we'll probably need to be going forward. John is asking, if you can't have herd immunity, it doesn't mean that you can't have a vaccine. Actually, the vaccine is what traditionally reliably causes herd immunity. Herd immunity is about 60 to 80% of the population. To get to that level of herd immunity often takes a vaccine to bolster up the immunities because you give a widespread vaccine. What we're seeing in wave 1 is, depending on the numbers you look at, we may have had an infection rate of 5 to 20%. So if you think about, we have an infection rate of 5 to 20%, and that's wave 1, and say 80,000 to 100,000 deaths by the time we're done, we would be looking at 300,000, 400,000 deaths if we were able to get to herd immunity by wave 3. But a big part of that is, if you can't get to herd immunity because, to your point, the antibodies aren't sufficient or they only last for 2 months, then a vaccine won't come into place. But you can still put in place treatment. Because remember, there's 2 things. Immunity prevents you from getting it. And we have vaccines for influenza that we do every year that helps keep us from getting it. But there's also treatment, which reduces the negative outcomes if you get it. And the treatment protocols are being researched just along with the vaccine. So even if we can't find a vaccine that boost our herd immunity enough, we can still put in place treatment protocols so that when people get it, they're able to be taken care of and won't necessarily die as often or have major complications. The other thing is, if we can't get an immunity because of the nature of the virus, having a dance-like approach where we have these capabilities that can identify who gets infected and quickly isolate them because of all these robust capabilities may be the only way we're able to have a functioning economy if it takes, if this is a multi-year thing that we're having to deal with. Looks like everyone else is answering vaccines. Yeah, many impediments to testing, Leah. Any questions on economic things? We're still a lot in the COVID. I know that's interesting. Do you have any questions on food supply, where the economy's going? I'm going to look through and see if I've missed anything else here. Good to see everyone. Appreciate it. Stopping by. Yeah, Valeria is talking about potential for labor abuse with the meat packings. This is a good point. A lot of the workers in the meat packer, whether it's in Canada and the US, are more vulnerable populations. So there's a risk of labor abuse either under unsafe conditions, or they have reduced access to healthcare. Did you see Plandemic yet? Just came across my feed. No idea what Plandemic is. Haven't seen it. Yeah, old-fashioned herd immunity doesn't work so well. In fact, old-fashioned herd immunity isn't herd immunity. It's just old-fashioned disease, right? So the 4 riders of the apocalypse are not war, death, famine, and herd immunity. It's war, death, famine, and disease. So, one of the reasons I actually, when people ask me on my New Year's Eve, ask me anything, what kept me up at night, my number one thing I predicted as my biggest concern was antibacterial resistant bacteria or novel virus. And the reason why is, as humanity goes, we have only been managing diseases well for probably, depending on how you rate it, 50 to 100 years tops, right? So we have a very limited history of being able to outclass this. And when it comes to a disease that's novel or new, like HIV vaccine took decades, and we don't even have a vaccine yet, but we have treatment. These things are very, very tricky. So it's the reason I was concerned. What will the effects be of president shutting down the COVID council? So Tyson, good question, good political question. The president has shut down the coronavirus task force, which means the daily theater of the briefing is over, in addition to it already being canceled because he was upset. But the practical effects of that are probably going to be the 2 primary healthcare advisors, Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci, who you would see on either sides doing various face palms and indignation. They're going to still be the primary advisors. But a lot of these task force, Tyson, traditionally in government, what they do is they help coordinate, and they help coordinate action. It was never really clear, though, how the coronavirus task force at the presidential level was actually coordinating action versus being a communication means. If we're being generous, it looked primarily like it was being used to communicate information, which had varying degrees of quality from, let's just say it had varying degrees of quality, versus the Jared Kushner task force. So there's still a task force inside the White House led by Jared Kushner. That is the one that I would say that task force has had the throw weight of being able to coordinate and reach into agencies and sort of coordinate response. Now, what they're doing with it, A lot of times it's misguided. We can argue it, but that task force is still intact. So the public-facing coronavirus task force that was in front of the cameras and was mainly being used for these daily briefings, that's being dissolved. The advisors, the two healthcare advisors, they're still advising the president, and I'm sure they're relieved to not have to get in front of the cameras every day and go through that nonsense. But the main sort of coordinating task force, the Jared Kushner one, is still in effect. It's still intact, and it's looking at issues like PPE, testing sufficiency, food supply. They've got a think tank, and again, that may be generous, but they've got a body inside the White House that is really reaching into all the agencies and trying to coordinate. Now, this, of course, it supersedes and sort of bypasses existing functions. You saw there was a former Rear Admiral who resigned from the Health and Human Services, I think it was last night or the day before. He was in charge of disaster response for pandemic-like stuff, but he had been bypassed almost entirely by this Kushner task force. And he's, the writing's on the wall, he can see it, and he's decided it's time to resign and step down. So the problem with these task forces, yes, they can be used to signal presidential priorities, but the way they function and to what extent they leverage existing national response plans, existing agency capabilities, or just running in like the Kool-Aid man in the wall and everyone's trying to run around. I mean, if Sabrina's on here, she can talk at length about how coordinated our pandemic response plans were, but those have been completely tossed out of the windows. Good question. Chris Noki, good to see you. Connor wondering how best pandemic is some big conspiracy productions and making the rounds, super high production quality and lots of misinformation to say the least. Connor, the best way to fight conspiracy theories is to share the Infomullet media literacy clips. If you go out to the YouTube channel, I try and hit these main conspiracies and I'll put them in a playlist called media literacy. And those actually target specific conspiracy theories. I'll do a 2 or 3 minute clip. It's very short. It's not an hour long Ask Me Anything. Production values are a little less. I mainly have Bonky. But those are designed, these media literacy are designed to do two things. One is to counter direct conspiracy theories. Like I go through a bunch that like flu dropped off mysteriously as COVID rise, or the deaths dropped off as COVID rises. I address those. But the media literacy playlist also includes tools of how you can evaluate information, because part of this problem is people are believing conspiracy theories and then they get stuck on them. Another is there's not a really good discussion of what are the tools you have to evaluate information coming at you and decide if it's a good or a bad theory. Now remember, induced herd immunity did not start out as a conspiracy theory. It was one of 5 pandemic responses in early March. And even in early March, I had some concerns about it that I wrote up in the blog. But the key is as these responses get evaluated, we use the tools, the media literacy tools, to say, is this a good explanatory theory? And the problem with induced herd immunity is it wasn't a good explanatory theory. It left more anomalies than it answered. And it kind of promised it was, and there's actually a clip in the media literacy called costume spotting. When a theory gets dressed up and it appeals to emotion, so this pandemic, without having seen it, I almost sure it has a lot of appeals to emotion in it about being a free thinker, being a critical thinker, keeping an open mind, things that it's trying to seduce the person watching it to flatter them and have the idea more receptible. So obviously my preference is to share the Infomullet media literacy clips, but it's gonna have to be, confronting misinformation is kind of like playing basketball. Just because you're there on the court doesn't mean you're good at it. And I was surprised at how little people were educating others on what the hammer and dance was. Here we're trying to argue against induced herd immunity, but we're not doing a good job communicating ourselves. So sometimes the best way of fighting disinformation is to be the exemplar of the right information and not get pulled into nasty rhetorical fights. Stick to your guns, present your cases, because you may not influence the one you're fighting against. Like, this is a key thing. You may not change the opinion of the person who has the wrong information, but the observing audience that's watching them. This is very important for a pandemic. There's always a lot of people watching these interactions, and they may be making judgments between the two positions of the argument. So if you're going up against someone who's has a conspiracy theory, don't start out saying, I'm going to change their opinion, and if I don't, I'm going to get upset. It was a waste of time. Consider how you're influencing the observing audience and play to them using the person in front of you as a foil. So that way, if they never change their mind and keep bringing up arguments, well, they're serving the need of informing that audience. And, measure your spoons, your energy, your ability to do this. I do it because I habitually do it. Other people may not want to do it because it's bad for their mental health. It's emotionally draining. It's exhausting. It's aggravating. It makes you want to scream. Don't do it if it harms you, but if you can maintain that calm and engage them, you may be able to influence the observing audience. Farrell asked, thank you, Farrell, for reminding me. The question I missed, anything about these food processing plants being located in small cities where most population depends on the plants for jobs in their own local economy? So very much by the nature of these meatpacking plants, that is going to be, they're large, so they want to be in some place that's rural and land is cheap. Those will tend to be around small towns. They are very labor intensive, so they're going to need a large amount of population, and they can't afford to pay that population much because food prices are very, very competitive, very thin margins. So these factors you describe, they tend to result either by intentional design or by emergence in sort of anchor plants that it anchors in this community, and that community, and this is not different from, say, mining, coal mining, or lumber mills, anything that fits these criteria, they tend to become anchor companies or facilities in that town. And that does create a challenge for the local municipal government, where it may not be that they intend to be bad relations or to favor the company, but the reality is they grow up with it, they're influenced by it, they may get donations by it, they know that they need to keep their constituents employed. It's very difficult for a small municipality officer to stand toe-to-toe with a big Tyson Foods or Bethlehem Steel, going way back for the steel producers, right? This is why state and national responses need to have some coherent strategy to basically come in and say, we're not going to leave this up to some small town mayor to make a call. The governor of the state, ideally, or the national response, which has been completely lacking, should be able in going in and helping create guidelines. There's no guidelines. The USDA, as far as I know, has not released guidelines on what constitutes a safe meatpacking plant. That should have been done in February and updated throughout. They're now relying on the CDC, and that's not really effective because the CDC is looking at the whole population. The FDA, the USDA, these are groups that should be involved in safety inspections and setting what the criteria is, the federal government. And that's a federal law and a federal statute. There's the federal ability to do that. In the absence of the federal, the state should be stepping in and doing that. Again, you shouldn't rely on the small town folks to do this on their own, or you're going to end up having exactly what we've happened, which is huge outbreaks in these small town areas. Seamus, good to see you. What do I think of media handling of the US protesters, the lockdown? I think they're doing a spotlight effect, and that's creating a feedback loop. So my understanding of these protest groups is that they're very small in number, right? A few hundred protesters, few dozen. Of course, they're armed to the teeth. They're provocative. Most protests, to be successful, have to be provocative to get on the news, and these have definitely succeeded at being provocative. But I don't think it's fair to say the genesis of these protest movements, there's arguments about something, whether it's astroturfed or not. I almost never get into that discussion because it is so hard to untangle back where something started and who picked it up and what it was. That there are experts who do that, and I'll let them decide whether it was truly astroturfed or not. But I think it taps into a very real concern that wasn't being addressed of economic, people want to say it's about liberty, right? You say it's about freedom when you want to feel strong, but what it's really about is fear. Fear of loss of way of life, fear that things are changing and we have no control. Fear is a powerful motivator to get people out who would normally not do something and do something that's not very bright. Obviously, under normal circumstances, I think we'd have a much better communication about why are we doing the lockdown. It would come from the president and the White House and be reinforced by the states. It's the absence of leadership that has allowed these protest movements to rise up in the vacuum of clear information. And in some cases, they're being encouraged by the leadership, right? You've got the Department of Justice is now going to investigate states for violations of civil liberties. You've got the president going out and tweeting, liberate this. I think those are political moves to play to a base. So even though it's a very small population of protesters, I think it reflects a real fear. And it may not be, percentage-wise, I think something between 60 and 80% of the country supports the lockdown, but that means 20% don't. So there's a significant number of people who don't. But the alliance of the Department of Justice and the president sort of encouraging them, I think, is really political. And my thought is, if the Department of Justice wants to investigate states for civil liberty violations, maybe they should start with voter suppression. I'm just going out on a limb here that one's been backlogged for a while. Maybe they should look into there first. But we'll see. And as someone who studies non-state actor violence, I don't see these groups as being despite their pageantry and all that, I don't see them as being as a risk of non-state actor violence like others do. They're very terrifying, but traditionally people who are intending to do violence are not broadcasting their intentions and as being as public. And the ones you have to watch out for are the ones that get rejected from these groups. Are the true believers, the slow burns, who may want to join up with this group, and the group is like, look, our clips are empty, we're not actually carrying ammo, this is a protest. The people who get rejected from that, like Dylan Roof in South Carolina and some of the other mass shooters, they're the ones you got to watch out for. They're the ones picking up on the signals that may not be affiliated with a organized protest group, but picked up their grievance from them, their radicalization. And this happens, this isn't just right-wing extremism, it happens in all ideological extremism. But in this case, there's a really strong undercurrent that could create radicalization that 12 to 18 months from now, you start seeing clandestine terrorism. John, John's asking, it's being recorded. It will be recorded. If you go up on YouTube, John, in the discussion, you'll see there's a link to my YouTube. All the Ask Me Anythings are recorded end to end, and as well, I break them up in clips. So those links are up in the top. Great article in Forbes about these protests back to gun rights. Yeah, it's important to know too, Ryan brings up a good point. Very rarely are protests standalone issues. They tend to be successful when they can glom on to other existing grievances or other existing concerns and begin creating some amalgamation. Valeria's mentioning the Premier of Ontario, called the local grown funks a bunch of yahoos. This is, I forget his name. He is the brother, for those of you in the US, this Premier of Ontario is the brother of the craziest mayor Canada's ever had in recent history. If you remember a crazy mayor in Canada, I think he's dead now. I think he died during a cocaine overdose. This is the brother. So this she's mentioning this Premier is somewhat like a Tea Party politician. And even he called some of the protesters a bunch of yahoos. I mean, it's one thing to so that you can talk about these protests in several ways. There is protesting that I'm not happy the shutdown is happening. That is a fundamental right in our country to protest. But do you need to be armed to do it? That's obviously a contentious issue. In Michigan, it's legal to enter the house, the state house, with weapons. That's a law. So there was no violation of laws when they did that protest. That doesn't mean the protest itself is sound or wise. Lots of things are legal and not very bright. And I think they're probably angering more people than they are gaining support. The other thing is just pure safety. If you're not wearing masks and you get in these protests, you're standing next to each other, you're potentially at risk for getting contagion. Again, these are areas that Michigan has one of the highest crude fatality rates in the nation. If you go up and look on our apps, you can do a comparison. It's like over 12% fatality. So, you know, it's not that Michigan has somehow been bypassed by the coronavirus, but it's very localized. If you go up to Northwest Michigan where the cluster is, it's very real there. But if you go into other parts of Michigan where these protests might be happening, or I may have the geographies mixed up, you may have a very different impression and think, oh, this is no biggie because I'm not seeing it in my local area. As we nationalize the death rate and these hot spots begin growing up and people get more familiarity with being sick, being hospitalized, knowing someone who died, I think you're going to have, again, a mitigating effect, but never underestimate the ability of a small amount of people to do crazy, wild things. If you need only 100 people armed to do a protest that gets you nationwide media attention, that's a very low threshold to meet. These protests are going to stay with us for a long time unless they start getting, they start violating laws, or a mishap happens, an accidental discharge, someone gets hurt. A lot of people who are at the protest not just get sick but die, some sort of visible thing, and then it will probably fade away and it will sort of disappear. These are almost like modern day flagellants, right? In the Black Death, the flagellants would walk around whipping themselves to cast out the sins. It was a reaction, probably not the wisest reaction. You're going to see, and there were lots of groups like that did things that didn't make much sense. Here is one that you may see. Again, the protests themselves, the grievance makes sense, but the way of protesting leaves something to be desired, I think. Jennifer, good to see you. Hopefully answered your question on Kawasaki. Yeah, Farrell asked about misfire. I often wondered, Farrell, about how many of those firearms were actually loaded. I don't know, for example. I don't know how heavy they were. And certainly a lot of the people in that protest were not exactly exhibiting to me a certain degree of professionalism in the way they were wearing their kit or holding their firearms. But If they are loaded weapons and there's a chamber, the chance of a misfire, it's a real chance. I mean, you're talking about these things happen. I don't think a misfire would result in a like bedlam. I've looked at tons of mass shootings, and even when there are multiple firearms in a mass shooting on opposing sides, it's a lot more restricted than people think about, because the human reaction to gunfire is not to return gunfire, it's to turn around and run or dive or hide. So even if there's a misfire, I'm not exactly, I mean, it'd be concerning because it might hit someone, it might hurt someone, but I don't think it would turn into a massacre necessarily. You know, if the police are there, it's really tense, and a couple people start firing, then all bets are off. But one discharge, not that that makes it a good idea. I'm kind of splitting hairs here, but it's definitely something that would be better if weapons were unloaded and the weapons were kept at home. Yeah, incompetence makes people dangerous. See, that's the thing I worry, to your point, Farrell, I worry much more about the effect these protests have on pressure that causes states to reopen than I do about a misfire or something like that. Because the consequence of a state reopening could be hundreds to thousands dead and tens of thousands of people sickened. And I think to the extent these protests are creating risk, the risk of reopening and the political pressure that's being put is much higher. I mean, we've already seen it manifest. It's much higher than the risk of the misfire. Yeah, and Mike Morrison. So Mike brings up one of my, and this is where we're a little bit over the hour, so a little trivia. Kent State riot, there were, I think, 6 people killed, 20 injured, misfire of authority. I've actually done an analysis of Kent State. Even when getting orders to fire on the crowd, less than 25% of the National Guard fired into the crowd. The majority of them fired up and over. So a little bit of trivia that what we often think about, that National Guard unit which opened fire on the crowd, even 3/4 of the people in that unit refused to fire at another person. And this is, you see this actually when you study violence. Infantry in Vietnam, most soldiers in Vietnam never shot at another soldier. They kind of fired in the general direction or hoped. It's very difficult to get someone who is not trained and experienced to shoot at another person. And so if a misfire happens and there's a fight or flight response, unless you have been extremely well trained or familiarized with it, you're probably going to take an action that will reduce the chance of additional fires. That, again, doesn't mean that it's safe. Other questions? So good. Oh, Doug Ford. Yes, Valeria, thanks. Doug Ford is the mayor that most Americans will remember as the crazy mayor who, it was his brother who is slightly less crazy and still alive, who had the comment about because Ontario has had these protests too. There were protests. These protests are happening. They're happening in France. They're happening in Ontario, Canada. They're the protests you see in India. And they're not always going to be, you know, the same ideological bent, the same weapons, but you're going to see a backlash of protests across these lockdown conditions because the economic pain is real. So how do we combat that? We be very clear about what we're doing and why with the hammer and the response. We actually do the things that allow us to reopen and we engage them. One of the challenges here is I think the vacuum of leadership coming out of the White House and the failure to have a national coordinated response of what's going on is that every state's doing it differently. Every state can argue its own set of facts, and there is no one truth. Even in the White House, the truth changed every day in the briefing. So it'll be interesting. Tyson was asking about the coronavirus task force briefing. I don't know if the net of that change is going to be good or bad, because it may be a net good if the confusion and misinformation and sort of prompt for conspiracy theories, that microphone shuts down and we're able to get more credible information. The question is, where is that credible information? Is Dr. Fauci going to be able to get on and give a weekly briefing himself? I don't see that as likely. Good to see everyone. Yeah, 13 targets engaged. So we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to give a few more minutes for people to ask questions. I'm starting to feel it. So recovery-wise, I'm starting to feel it now, and it's 10 minutes after the hour rather than an hour. So I've gained 10 minutes of lung capacity from where I was last week. Good questions. Rory, good to see you. Thanks for taking the break. Unfortunately, we're at the tail end, but you can start watching from the beginning and listen to the greatest hits. Again, I always forget to say this, but I need to say it. If you haven't subscribed to the InfoMullet, please check us out at www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. In fact, I will type it out here. Let's see. There. I didn't even spell it right. There. Click on that link if you want. Subscribe to become a muleteer. It's only $5 a month. We do analysis. We do charts. We talk about non-state actors. We talk about foreign affairs. It just happens in the last couple months we're mainly talking about COVID. And Mike, thanks for giving me the thumbs up and wearing the mask. Like and subscribe, follow, do all the fun stuff, share it. I'm loopy now. I'm probably better off signing off before I do something I'm going to regret. Yeah, I'm feeling a little lightheaded. Anyways, folks, it's been good. Thanks for all your support and help during the recovery. And again, share the video, and I'll go ahead and put these clips up on YouTube when we're done. Everyone take care, stay safe, wear a mask. Bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a muleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.